The Juneau World Affairs Council presents the Syrian Refugee Crisis, from the front lines to the headlines, with Eric Kocher. Kocher is an EMT and attorney from Haines who spent 6 months in Greece with medical and legal teams helping Syrian refugees who have fled war.
Thank you for coming this evening. When I was flying up here, I felt tears welling up in me. I was watching a movie called Concussion on the flight, and a Nigerian doctor, played by Will Smith, is being asked by his church to accept as a house guest a woman newly arrived in the United States from Kenya. You can see his reluctance and his wish to beg off the responsibility. Through my tears, I could see the gift that my work with the refugees had provided me. Without realizing it, in the last 6 months, I'd learned to look past the stereotypes, past my own prejudices and biases, to see my own reflection in the faces of the refugees. I was seeing each refugee as an individual, holding the same hopes and fears and uncertainties that we all experience as we navigate the paths and opportunities that life offers. In so many ways, challenging my comfort zone, my experiences in Greece gave me a way to open myself up little by little. Each opening provided me with wisdom, connection, and enrichment. I gained the ability to see our common humanity, to feel our connections, and to identify the needs and fears and hopes of the refugees. The Nigerian doctor says to the Kenyan woman at one point, "Need is not weak, need is need." So this evening, with the help of some videos and pictures, I'm going to share with you what I've learned over the last 6 months with refugees in Greece who are escaping from violence and war and political repression from untold countries throughout the Middle East, Northern Africa, and even parts of Asia. One thing I learned was not to get lost in the numbers, which are enormous and overwhelming. Think one person at a time. Look into the faces of the refugees when the pictures give you that opportunity. Now, what do I mean by the numbers were enormous and overwhelming? Well, consider this, 1 million refugees came across the Aegean Sea from Turkey to Greece last year. That is the entire population of Alaska plus another third. Greece has a population of 11 million and is about the size of Ohio. Refugees arriving in Greece made up 1/10 of Greece's population. If the United States were to encounter a similar migration, it would be 32 million refugees coming across the border in a 1-year period. That's almost the entire population of Canada. So, one thing if you look up on the map on the board here, refugees are coming from Morocco here, Algeria, all along here, from Iran, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, back off the map from Bangladesh, Somalia, all sorts, and they all arrived right here on Turkey, on this little stretch of Turkey. All these 1 million folks, or almost 580,000 last year, arrived here, here, and then came across this little 6-mile stretch of ocean to the northern beaches of Lesbos. This is 10-kilometer stretch right here that they all landed on. And so in the highest month was the month of October. 135,000 people showed up. That's almost 5,000 a day. Some days there would be over 100 rafts that would arrive on those beaches. They hold about 50 people each, those rafts. When I was there in November, we had 103,000 show up on those beaches. So it's quite a number. So in my first 4 months, which started in November, I was over there as an EMT. I'm licensed in both Alaska and in Georgia. I volunteer with the Haines Fire Department. And that was what I expected all of my work to be over there. When the borders closed, and that happened in March, then suddenly, and also some agreements with Turkey by the European Union, Turkey then started to make a real effort to stop those refugees from coming across. And eventually they were effective. So that by now, in the month of May, we're halfway through it, and only about 300 refugees have come across in that time period. As well, but the borders out of Greece have been closed. So suddenly there are some 54,000 refugees stuck in Greece. So that sort of changed the dynamic. And so when I went back over in March and April, I went over there as a lawyer, which I also have been for quite a while, and worked with a Greek lawyer up on the border and in the port. So the places I've been are the island of Lesbos right here, Athens, which is just off the map below, and then the border up here with Macedonia. And in Greece, they don't call it Macedonia, they call it the former Yugoslav republic known as Macedonia, because they take offense because there's parts of Greece that are called Macedonia, and so they don't like the idea that this country has taken over part of them. And this border town has like 100 people in it. So it's a very small town, but we'll see some pictures from there. So this is taken from the island of Lesbos, and you're seeing Turkey in the distance over there. It's one of the clearer days we've had. But this now, these are the beaches that line the northern area. Those are all life jackets along there. They came in boats, some wood boats like this. They just get abandoned after they arrive. Or this, but most people came in rafts like this. And these are, you can see they have plywood floor. They see the little plywood cutout paddle right there. But they were filled with people when they came. And you can see how heavily laden they are and how low they are in the water. See, there's white caps out there. Not every day was as calm as some of these pictures will suggest. So this is the first video, it gives you some idea. Most of these are calm things. There were times when there was a lot of chaos involved, especially when the seas were rough, and when it was night, and people coming in at night, not knowing where they're coming. So there are Spanish lifeguards were volunteers that showed up because it's off season for them in the winter, and they would be the ones going out and greeting the boat. So these boats, though, would come across heavily channels. You can see there's huge ships going across. This is the Greek Coast Guard, and this is one of the ferries that that service Greece. Much bigger than the ones we have here, and many more, and much more extensive system than we have here in Alaska. Sometimes there were safety boats that could meet the rafts and guide them into safer parts along the shoreline. So you'll see on this one there's young children on board. They'll be handed out first. There's like an infant. One of the youngest kids I saw had been born the day before in Turkey, before the parents came over on the thing. But usually the kids are, not that young. You can see a couple of young ones being 2- and 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds being brought over. So rafts kept coming. I keep showing you these. They're all different. The experiences are all different for us, but they may look similar. But they keep coming and coming. This crowd, you'll hear sort of a cheer go up as they get in closer. There are a lot of different voices. In the foreground, you can see huge piles of life jackets that are already being cleaned up and piled up. So rafts keep coming. So this one comes in, and right after it, here comes the second one. So that's 100 people all showed up right there. Many of them have been hidden in the woods in Turkey for a day or two, have had little water or food. They may be very wet, depending on the conditions coming over. A lot of them don't have any idea what their, let me get this back to the beginning here. Well, just watch this. You'll look at how this one is not being steered very well. That's because a refugee was put behind on the tiller of the motor. The motor is very weak, maybe a 30 horsepower motor. The rafts are overloaded, and so they're very hard to steer. But most likely this refugee, this is the first time he's been on a boat, if he's come from Syria, Damascus, someplace like that. When people arrive, this is sort of what it looks like. They often get space blankets. The man being carried up here by the lifeguards is using crutches, has a deformed leg. But you'll see, there are plenty of women and children coming out of here. There are also the guys that are in the boat there are what we used to call scavengers, people that were taking some of the supplies and stuff away. So what happens to the refugees when they arrive? So they arrive on this 6-mile stretch of beach, and they're lined up here. Here, all these folks, hundreds of them, are waiting for buses to come and pick them up. There are 2 bus pickup points on either end of this 6 miles, but it often meant that people, if they landed in the middle, had to hike, like these couples did. And this map was prepared to give the refugees sort of an idea of what was ahead of them. So when they landed up here in this area, they then finally get to a bus and come down to a registration center down here. But if they landed up on the beaches wet or cold, or it was dark or at night, they often might stay in tents that were set up by volunteer groups up there. There would be warming huts and tents that were designed for medical treatment and for hypothermia if necessary. But you can imagine at the height of the season how many folks there are coming when you've got up to 5,000, 6,000 each day hitting up here. People were always drying their shoes to try and get them dry, because those would almost always get wet from the bottom of the boat. Often we would see passports left with a life vest on the shoreline, and those were because people that came from certain countries wanted to be able to say they were from Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan, the countries that were more likely to be able to get registered and get across the border. This is not all of these life jackets were good. This says it's not a life-saving device. Will not protect against drowning. Use only under constant supervision, not for use in boating. The refugees were charged $100 for these life jackets like this, along with $1,200 for this raft ride that they took. And it's sort of ironic, because in one sense these are life-saving things, and in another sense they give the impression that they would save a life, but they may well not if they're stuffed with straw or cardboard. So life did go on in parts of Greece, even with all these refugees coming through. So this is just down the road a couple of hundred feet from where a lot of them arrived, and where some of them in the encampments that were there to meet people. We could eat lunch or dinner here and keep our eye on what was going on with whether rafts were coming in or not. Farmers were still dealing with their sheep in this situation, and people would be landing on the coast right behind them and walking up these roads. This man was harvesting olives and taking them down to an olive press where olive oil was made down in this small little town. These 3 ladies from the town would take their afternoon walks and sit here on the beach right where the rafts would come in. And many of them have in the past and were still involved in helping out with the refugees. They're very generous people. As much as there's some animosity and resistance to the refugees in Greece, it's amazing how, with such a poor country going through such financial crises, how much the individual people give. This is Malcolm Brabant, a PBS News reporter with the NewsHour that was there a good deal and reporting. I found his reports to be very accurate, which was refreshing to see that from a media perspective. The other thing that would happen when these rafts would come is they would have to get, what would happen to them? If we did nothing with those rafts, they would not only litter the beach but make it more dangerous. The outboard engines would be in the water. So they would be scavenged. A lot of the locals would take the plywood and use it. The plastic from the rafts would sometimes be used. But then people would also take the engines from the back, and this is where they would end up. This is on the ferry dock, and this is where the ferry goes back to Turkey. And so there were hundreds of these engines that are probably going back to be reused. So different people had different reactions once they landed on the beach. Here, a man and his wife, somewhat older than the general population of folks coming. She's still in her life vest. She's holding his Quran, and he is praying and kissing the ground there. Other people did this. They were on their iPhones and cell phones. They were taking pictures and selfies, but they were excited and ecstatic, and they were communicating back to Turkey, both to relatives maybe or other people or their homeland, that they had made it across what they thought of as the most dangerous part of the trip. They also would have been notifying the independent third party that's holding the 1,200 euros that they paid for this trip. And they give a code that authorizes the release of that money, and the smugglers have their own code and can go pick it up at that point. So a lot of children, almost 40% of them were children. 40% of the people coming across on these rafts. So some of them, one-on-one, families of a couple, like more extended families here. You can see a lot of kids. All of these girls were on a raft that was adrift out in the middle of the Aegean out there and got picked up by a safety boat and brought in. They look just like kids on the streets here in Juneau, I tell you that. A lot of them even wearing clothes that you would think they just, you wouldn't have thought they were on a raft. So another problem we had is that some of the people over here is a lighthouse. And people that aren't experienced a lot with the water, when they're coming at night in the rafts, they head for the lighthouse, which is the last place we want them to show up. Or in the daytime, they can see the orange of the life jackets that are on the rocks at the lighthouse, because that's one of the hardest places for us to clean up. It's a 2-hour trip to get there unless you get over there by boat. So at night, we would be up there with night vision binoculars looking for rafts coming. This is actually a Coast Guard vessel out there, but we would have shifts and look for them. And if we saw a raft coming, heading towards the lighthouse, we would call the rescue boats and try and get them out there in time to redirect them to a safer part of the beach. If we weren't successful, this is sort of a map that describes for them and shows you what happened. They would arrive here, have to climb up a cliff to where the lighthouse was. Then they would have to walk 0.8 of a kilometer up to this point, where we could finally hire local Greek farmers to come down with their pickup trucks and put people in the back of the pickup trucks and then take them up to an abandoned cheese factory where a large bus could then pick them up and take them on down to the registration camp. So this is the lighthouse area in the daylight. This is a boat that was brought refugees over that was just abandoned there. We would sleep in tents outside of these buildings because it was too dangerous to sleep in them. They're falling apart. And this is sunrise in the morning. That's a boat that came in right there the night before that we weren't able to see because everybody was inside, so it didn't give off much of a heat signature. So I decided that one of the things I would do is go over to Turkey and sort of see what I could find out about the circumstances over there and if there was any way to help guide the refugees that were coming in the boats in a safer way to avoid the lighthouse and other things. So I went over in a ferry. This is on market day, so a lot of Greeks are going over to the Thursday market in Ayvalık, Turkey. It costs €5 to get over there, another €5 to get back, but the refugees can't do it. So this is what I saw in the market. I was a little surprised at some of these displays, but this was more typical. But I was going over there to find out what Lesbos looked like for one. So this is the image of Lesbos that shows up when you're over there. It's a little hazy. And I spent the night there, and first thing in the morning I'm having breakfast right on the shoreline, and here come refugees that are coming to get into a raft. So they're walking along the beach and expecting to meet up with a smuggler somewhere. Now at the time that this was going on, there was actually a Turkish patrol boat coming and blowing a siren and stuff, so I think they never made it. We never saw a raft go. But eventually, so I went around, explored the beaches on a long stretch. This is a beach that had clearly been used in the past to get refugees over, but was not being used at present. But eventually, I happened to stumble on a spot where smugglers had arrived with a huge busload of people and the gear to get the raft going. So they go back into the woods, and they hide in the woods waiting for the right moment. So here's some people coming to ride that, families and kids and everybody else. And then they would put in on a beach like this, and if you can see what's on the shore there, it's a close-up of it, a wheelchair. You don't get to take your wheelchair. All wheelchairs and all sorts of things like that get abandoned on the beach. They need to keep as much room. They're wanting to keep as much room as possible for people. So an hour and a half later, after those folks arrived, this is the first raft coming out from a beach, and then there's two here. You can see one over here, one over here. And as the sun is setting, that raft is on its way, and it's going to show up right here in this area. This is not that raft, but this is what it's like coming in at dark on the shoreline. So this is what the area looks like in daylight, and this is our medical clinic, which is a renovated bus. This is the Adventists were instrumental in setting this up. Amazing group, very welcoming of me, who's not an Adventist, and the three of us that were there to work beside their doctors. I was working beside doctors from South Africa, from Germany, from the United Kingdom, with Muslim doctors from Sweden, all over the place. Amazing group. This was what's inside. We had it pretty well stocked with supplies. This is a close-up to show you what this used to be a bookmobile. Library bookmobile. So one of the problems was language, right? I mean, they're Arabic, Farsi, a lot of different. We didn't have interpreters all the time. Sometimes people that came over would speak, but we would use these cheat sheets at times. We would use a clock to talk about how often to take medication, whether to take it at sunrise or sunset, how many hours in between. And then we saw people that had been wounded in war over there. This is a stabbing victim from something, probably from the smugglers. This young child had deformed feet, unable to walk. This person was a gunshot victim. I don't know who put that in him, but that's how he arrived where we were. Here's a woman on IVs that we had to get to the hospital. There's 2 ambulances on this island, and they're 2 hours away. So they get put on in a private vehicle and sent down. This is a Greek pediatrician who comes and spends his weekends up there. This is a 14-year-old girl who I met on the dock at the port. Her raft with 50 other people on it had been adrift out there, and she came off the boat and was carrying this big, huge bag, and I went to help her, and I asked her where her parents were, assuming they would be in amongst all these people. They weren't. She hadn't seen her father in 3 years. He'd been lost in the war, Afghanistan. Her mother and her, so she was traveling, 14, with a 12-year-old and a cousin, all of them under 18. She's the only one who spoke English, amazing English. And her mother had been part of the group coming with them, and they'd been in 2 different vehicles going through Turkey, and the police stopped the vehicle that the mother was in. And that's the last communication they had with the mother, so we don't know what happened to her. This is just this is a nurse over here who was one of the people working with Doctors Without Borders at the hospital that was bombed in October in Kunduz, Afghanistan. And it's sad to say that was a bombing by the U.S., and we heard about the horrendous circumstances there. This is a group of the medical folks from all around the world that were working there. So these people, once they arrived and we saw them at the beaches, they would then go down to the main part of Lesbos and have to get registered. But that could take several days or a week under various conditions. So here people are lined up waiting to get into this registration area, which is a police stockade. And they would have to sleep out here in what was called Afghan Hill, not an official camp. That was just run by volunteers. This whole medical tent back here, all of these tents provided by volunteers, hundreds and hundreds of them. And eventually they would get registered, and at that point they would be allowed to leave the island. They could purchase a ferry ticket and go from Lesbos here either to Athens or to Kabbalah, because what they're trying to do is get across the border. This is when the border was open. Food is being distributed here by Oxfam and others. There were other groups, like this is No Borders Clowns showing up, Clowns Without Borders. And what you don't realize, I mean, you think the basic needs are what's most important, security, food, shelter, but having some kind of entertainment or activity for the children is right up there as one of the most important things, because it helps the parents and it does a huge amount for the kids. But these are all people in line waiting to get registered right here. So there are all sorts of volunteer efforts. Here's one that I like called Dirty Girls of Lesbos. And what they did, and this happened all the time with volunteers. You'd come and there'd be a lot of volunteers. You'd think there'd be too much, but then you'd come up with a need that nobody had recognized. And here, this was the clothes that the refugees who arrived soaking wet and discard were just going into a landfill. They came up with a whole system that allowed them to go to a commercial laundry, get washed, and brought back for the next set of volunteers, next set of refugees showing up, and all along this 6-mile coast. So they had systems where it was collected and so forth. And this is the three of them that got it started. The woman on the right is from the U.S., but of Greek origin. This woman has been in Greece for 30 years, but from the United Kingdom. And here, a bunch of us medical people, when we have a break, we're sorting socks for them and pinning pairs of socks together in groups of 3 pairs each so they can be washed and kept together. Other volunteers had stuff shipped to them. This is a local Greek family that was getting boxes shipped to them. They've been dealing with these rafts for years up there because even though they weren't coming in these numbers, they had been coming. Here is a soup kitchen prepared by a high school girl living on Lesbos, and her mother came out and prepared food for the refugees landing there. So a huge volunteer effort. Here I'm helping to unload boxes, 78 boxes of shoes that were sent over at the airport, and we were loading them into a van. Tractor trailer trucks, this one came from Germany, filled with supplies. And then what happens to them? Well, then people find places to put them. This is one of many warehouses on Lesbos where all the supplies are sorted, and then the different volunteer groups can come down and get them. So freedom of movement's an important thing for them, and that's what they were moving. All these folks had no interest in staying in Greece. They knew that the economy was difficult, 25% unemployment rate, questions about whether they're still going to be in the Eurozone and stuff like that. They wanted to get to Germany and other places. Many of them had relatives in Germany that had preceded them. A lot of the husbands had gone, or the brothers. The men seemed to go initially, and then the women and children would be coming afterwards. But when I got up to so I went up to the border next in December, and the border was still open. This is what it looked like. Just an open field. And this is the actual border fence, believe it. There wasn't even a fence here until probably at some point in November, because the train tracks went through, and you don't have a fence to block off the train, and there was no other enforcement. So this was a known route to just pass on through, go through Macedonia and through the Balkan states and get up to Germany. And then Macedonia sort of tightened things up, created an actual gate that you have to go through. And they would open it at all different times of the day or night, but there was no system to it. It was very unfair to the refugees, and in December and January, it was bitter cold up there, and they could often be kept hours or even longer out there. But here is, as you can see, some of the graffiti, but look at all these countries that these people were not now being allowed through. Moroccans, Pakistan, Somalia, I think that means Lebanon, Ghana. I mean, I was amazed. There was a whole group of people from Nepal in this area up here. From Bangladesh, from Pakistan, from Iran, from places that weren't war zones. So this is a demonstration that's going on. It's peaceful, but there's sort of large people walking around and protesting the fact that the border was closed to them. And here are some Somali women that say, "Please, Balkans, release Somalis." So these Somali women are stuck there at the border. So this is what happened. You ended up having several thousand people starting to accumulate at the border because they couldn't get through. No Borders Kitchen, set up by a bunch of anarchists, people that don't believe in NGOs, that aren't an NGO themselves, are there providing free meals. So look at this long line of people here getting food. So this is the medical team that was up there. Sometimes the doctors worked out of little carts like this. This is an ambulance from the Macedonian side that hardly looks like an ambulance. Often the medical supplies would be in the back of a van, and the patients would be lined up on the side of the road, and that's where medicines would be administered. We also had a tent where this could happen, so we had 4 or 5 stations here where people could be. This is a person that tried to kill himself by hitting himself on the head with a rock. When I came across him out in the field, he was unconscious, had his buddies wrap him up in a carpet, which I think is still here, and eventually he was taken to a psychiatric hospital, visited him a couple of days later. But they had no real mechanism or supplies to deal with them. We had people that were overcome by fumes from burning plastic and other things, either in their tents or in fires outside of their tents to try and stay warm. Sometimes our treatment of people would be out right at the border. This was at the border. You see the little fence behind there? Well, these guys were right there, and then as you look up above them, this is what you see. The police up here and this huge crush of people all trying to get across through this border fence right here. Also, volunteers provided charging stations for cell phones. Volunteers, not big NGOs, just volunteers set up free Wi-Fi in the camps. Volunteers purchased this firewood from local Greek farmers and stuff so that the refugees could have it to keep warm. And there was so many fires at times, it would have a haze over it, like Skagway used to be with the cruise ships, maybe still is. But there was a lot of danger. I think this guy was using some kind of liquid to get this fire going, which looked pretty dangerous. But we didn't just treat people there. We dealt with it. So this is late at night. And these guys from Morocco had gone across the border, snuck across the border, been captured by Macedonian police, beaten up, and what they try and do is beat you on your legs and your feet so you can't walk. And then they tore up their papers, their registration paper, which is the one document that allows them to do anything. So suddenly I decided, why don't we see if we can put these together? And what was amazing, as small as these pieces were and as many as there were, we got both of their registration papers back together again. That's duct tape on the back of it, doing it. So that changed an experience that had been really depressing and down for them, not like their life had really been improved a lot, but just all of us working together really made, just was a personal experience that, they were happy, we were all sort of happy. Of course, what happened, so then people are still going across the border at night. This is a woman in a wheelchair that's getting pushed up right over here. And slowly going through the border. But the next day, after those guys were there, and after I'd been at the border a couple of days, the police decided to move all of those refugees, those thousands of refugees that couldn't get across the border, they moved them all back to Athens. So police showed up, and they rounded them up, and it was an amazing thing to see. This is the number of buses, at just the beginning of buses, that they had a line of them moving them all out. Now all these people, their whole plan was to get across the border. Going back to Athens is not doing them any favors. And they ended up getting dumped off in the streets of Athens without any places to stay. And so that situation was pretty desperate. So a couple of months later, I'm back up at the border, and there's now 14,000 people up there because the border is all totally closed. And they're still staying up there. So what had happened is, even though those people went back by buses, there were still a lot of people that were able to come up that were being allowed to go across, Syrians, Afghans, and Iraqis. But now those were closed. Macedonia decided not to let them through. So as a lawyer, I was coming up there to trying to deal with asylum claims. Suddenly, that was the most important thing. How do we prevent them from getting sent back to Turkey? In the past, they'd just been able to pass on through. But now Greece was being faced with this huge 54,000 refugees in all of Greece, 14,000 at the border, and would like to have sent them back to Turkey. And so it was important for them to understand what their asylum claims were. And we were up there to interview people about a couple of different things. One is unaccompanied minors, to establish that they did have no plan for these unaccompanied minors, like that young girl. They only had 400 hosting spots for unaccompanied minors in all of Greece, and there are thousands of kids without parents or adults, responsible adults with them, up there. So we were helping out people up there. So we had to walk to our law office, as it was. We're carrying papers and printer with us. We had to walk by all of these scenes. I'm going to have to speed it up a little bit, but so you can see the numbers of people. We had to navigate across this water. People are out there with their clothing or walking down the tracks now, back around. This is a long line of people over here that are getting in a food line. And then finally, this is our little information tent where we set up the law office to talk to individuals. This is what it looked like inside. But once we got started, it was just jammed with people. There was no privacy. There was no way to deal with anything in there. Sometimes we would go out, like here I went out to talk to some people that had been beaten up and pushed back by the Macedonian police. This is over in another part of the encampment. So I'm there just interviewing somebody. I've got an interpreter right here. That's what it looks like outside. That was also going on around there. Everything was happening out there. But the one thing right next to our tent was a children's tent for young kids, and another circus tent, they called it, for the older kids. And that was one of the best things that was going on there. A couple of my friends, when I hardly ever had a break, but I would go out there for a couple of minutes in the middle of the day just to get some sunlight. Then the very last day, right at the evening, we suddenly got attacked by about 20 friends of one guy that we had not interviewed and who was angry at the interpreter that was there. And so he brought all his friends back. And this gives you a little bit of idea of what. That was as much as we got of that. So this is where actually, I know this looks like a refugee place. This is where I was sleeping when I was up there. I was sleeping in a place with a huge collective of people, mainly doing cooking. But in this place, I was up, there were about 20 of us sleeping on the floor in this room. My conditions in Athens were a little better. I got to sleep in the law office here, so this was the bed I was sleeping in. Pretty beautiful place and doing a lot of work. But then I would spend the evenings in the daytime down at the port of Piraeus, which is in Athens. And that port had thousands of refugees that went into abandoned buildings. And so there's over 100 tents here with 4 or 5 people in a tent inside this building. So we set up a table right here to do interviews with an interpreter. It was right next to where the food was being distributed. That's our team. And then we also would sometimes go to the actual tents and talk to people. And late at night, the lawyer I work with, Eric Kocher, was out here trying to give refugees advice as to what their rights were and the need to apply for asylum. This is what the entrance to that building looked like in the daytime. So we're at the end of the slides. These are some pictures I'll leave you with of the done by kids, children. So that looks like an optimistic one. This one, is a child or young girl in a life ring. Here is the sun shedding tears up here. There's a refugee raft here. And this is one that depicts a scene of war and conflict. Bombs being dropped, stretchers, ambulance over here. This was a sign in one of the buildings: drop everything, let's embrace discomfort. As others carry on, we take the other path. Well, so let me talk to you a little bit about some of the problems that we were dealing with as a lawyer up there also. And then I'll take questions in a minute or two, a couple of minutes. But the problem with unaccompanied minors that I mentioned, some minors were brought to the asylum office in Athens, and they were willing to process them. But the reason we were there was because the European Court of Human Rights had received a petition from the lawyer I was working with, a week, 10 days before, raising concerns about what was happening with unaccompanied minors. And the Greek government said, well, it's not a problem. We just don't know where they are. If they show up, we can take care of them. We know what to do with them. So, of course, 4 of them were produced at the asylum office in Athens, and they didn't want to deal with them at first. And finally, we got them to register them, which all that means is you get scheduled for an appointment 4 months away for your asylum interview. But when it got to what are you going to do about housing them and hosting them, we can't do that. We've got 300 people that we can't even place. And so that established what we were trying to show, is that they're not. Today, in today's newspaper in Greece, there's a report that the UN inspection team is continuing to raise questions about unaccompanied minors. They were being kept in jails. Kids as young as 10 were in jails in some of these smaller towns for their protection. So that's one of the problems that exist here. The other thing is with all of these vulnerable people, women with children, with 4 or 5 children, the only way you were given to apply for asylum was you had to use Skype. A lot of them don't know what Skype is. But even if you did know, you couldn't get through because there was only 2 hours a week when you could Skype in Arabic. And there's 54,000 people up there. So how is it possible? So that was the other purpose of what we were trying to do up there, was to establish that in reality, people could not Skype. I talked to hundreds of people that had tried to Skype. Some of them had videotaped. There's a YouTube video of an hour trying to get through on Skype. There's people with their taking screenshots showing how they had tried to Skype with their phone and either it call failed, there was no answer. So this was all to protect them so that they don't get forced back to Turkey because they haven't applied for asylum, because they all want to apply now, and they're trying to. So that was just one of the pieces that we were involved in. So let's see what kind. We've got 15 minutes for questions, or I'll keep talking. Yes, maybe you should come up to the mic if you can, or if you want to, I'll repeat it. I'll repeat it. Yeah. Uh-oh.
I may have missed it, but what organization did you go under the auspices of then?
Actually, you didn't miss it. I didn't mention it.
Okay.
I actually went over with a group called Remote Area Medical, who never actually established a presence there. I was doing an investigation for them. I was making recommendations for them. I ended up working with the Adventists in November because they were so welcoming. They said, just treat this as your own emergency room. We work with their doctors. We ended up setting up shifts with them. When I went to the border in December up at Idi Amini, I sort of got myself embedded or working with a group called Doctors of the World. Not Doctors Without Borders, but Doctors of the World. I think they were originated in Spain. They're extensive all around. They're much more able to take volunteers for shorter periods of time. Doctors of the World takes volunteers for like 9 months is the minimum. So they want to. But what was really interesting is when I showed up at the border up there, all of the medical facilities had been trashed because there had been a riot by refugees because of their inability to get across the border because of what was happening. And so most of the facilities had been, and so I got there at the same time that some of the coordinators got there. So it was nice because I was able to sort of get myself established and work then for a couple of weeks with Doctors of the World out of their tent. And we worked closely with Doctors Without Borders, a group called Praxis, which is a Greek group, the Hellenic Red Cross also. So there were 4 groups up there that took shifts and took turns. And we happened to be on the overnight shift on the night that before the morning when the police came, so we were actually in the compound area. They had blocked off and not let anybody else come. All the volunteers and stuff that ordinarily would come were being kept away. There's an effort now that has, as time went on, there was more and more of an effort to restrict what a lot of the smaller nonprofits and independent volunteers were doing. They were trying to make it harder on Lesbos. You were supposed to register. You could get in trouble if you weren't registered. What I've been told now up at the border at Idi Amini, where there's at least 12 to 14,000 people still, is that they're trying to prevent the volunteers from bringing food in because they're trying to make it unattractive for the refugees because they want to get them moved to camps that are spread out all around Greece, and that a lot of them are military-run camps. And there are good intentions, I think, in what they're trying to do, but the food at the camps we hear, the military camps, are terrible, whereas the volunteer food is much more palatable to the folks, and at least there's some variety in it. There's a lot more freedom of movement up there. There's a lot, but what you're starting to see is a shift. The camps are a smaller number of sizes, 1,000, maybe 800, 500, and volunteer groups, the smaller ones, are now starting to associate with different of the military camps. And so they're bringing in amazing things, whether it's working with kids and educational things. There's some where they're setting up organic gardens, and they're actually bringing school kids from the local community in to work at the garden, as well as the refugee kids. But one of the things they've identified, that Greece has no history of integrating refugees into the community. So even though they've seen millions come across and pass on through, they've got 54,000 that may well be there for quite a while, even though there's some effort for the folks that have relatives in Germany and other places to get moved on. But nothing moves fast there. So that's very frustrating. I worked with another group called Refuge Aid, which is a medical group in Laros. And then the last group I worked with medically was Lighthouse Relief, which is now spread around in a lot of the camps. But their encampment on the coast of Lesbos that was there, which was a huge place, able to deal with 1,000 refugees showing up a day with clothing stuff, they've actually dismantled all that. There's still core group of people from Lighthouse Relief on Lesbos that are doing environmental cleanup. They're cleaning up the beaches and of all the rafts and all of these life jackets and everything else, so that the beaches will be, and pretty much, even when I left, looked pretty good. So again, it's amazing. These are volunteers, so many of them from Europe, young, just, I mean, and how creative they are and how the initiative they take, and ones from the United States. I mean, there were a couple of us old folks there, but it was driven and run by young people whose intentions were great, and the whole effort was to treat refugees as individuals and not as sort of a mass of people, which it's easy to get lost in. Another question? Yes.
I was wondering, with countries that are not at war, are fairly miserable to live in, like Nepal, Bangladesh, and
Yes.
even Pakistan, the inclusion of these folks coming, I think I was in Europe when Angela Merkel gave
Right.
the big welcome.
Right.
And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about why these other folks are coming in with
Well,
the Syrian refugees.
Well, some of them are more individualized reasons, dealing with political repression. I mean, I met a middle-class couple from Iran that was well-to-do, was able to fly out of Tehran to Istanbul and then hook up with smugglers, and showed up 5 days after they left Iran. They were at the border. But they left because, as the husband said, we have freedom of speech, but once you speak, you're no longer free. And what happened is he'd been in jail for 6 months. And so I never appreciated how important that, to hear somebody would disrupt what was otherwise not a bad life, I think, up there because of that lack of freedom. But so, there's a lot of, people are discriminated against because of their sexual orientation and stuff like that. So you have some of those people. But many of them are young. Many of those that come from those other countries like Somalia and Morocco and so forth are mainly young men that are looking for a better life in some way or whatever. But we're going to see a lot of that. I mean, there's, what I didn't appreciate, to me, I was overwhelmed. There's 100,000 people showing up in a month here, and we've got 50,000 people stuck in Greece right now. That's nothing. That's a microcosm. There's 3 million Syrians in Turkey. There's 1 million in Lebanon. There's 600,000 in Jordan. And that's not even the biggest refugee problem we got. There's huge refugees from starvation and droughts and stuff in northern Africa that are there. And what I can't appreciate is there's a whole question, should we even have borders? I mean, that's a pretty radical thought, but are we going to be able to stop? How are we going to stop people from coming? We don't actually, right? I mean, we've got a lot of people that come across the border from Mexico, or at least have historically. But if there's 100,000 a month on the border down there, you're not going to be able to stop them unless you're going to shoot them. Now, in Iran, there was some of that going on. Well, we heard people that had to go through Iran to get from Afghanistan, I think. The Iranians often would shoot people at the border, and that caused a lot of trauma for some of the young kids that saw the bodies coming through. I mean, I haven't talked a lot about the individual circumstances of people, but there was an Afghan couple that 3 children, them. The mother had lost vision in her left eye from shrapnel from a bomb, was told that she needed to have some kind of operation to, allow her eye to open up or something. The husband had 4 of his 5 digits on his right hand severed by the Taliban, who were trying to extort ransom from his family, which he had none. And then their 5-year-old child is the one that's the most tragic one, because he is traumatized by what he witnessed on the trip over to Greece, and is afraid of people, is so sensitive to the touch that, when he sleeps at night with them, they all sleep in the same tent, they touch him, he has a reaction. I mean, it's a really serious problem. And when they're moving, there's no way for them to really get much psychological treatment, and it's not even wise necessarily to try and slow them down to take up but at some point, they're going to have to deal with a lot of that. So did I answer your question? I'm not even sure where we were. I got off on a rant. Yes?
Some folks have concluded that the Syrian war is probably the consequence of a severe drought, which may be some aspect of,
Yeah.
of climate change. Is that your understanding?
Well,
And-
I understand that there's a part of it that is yes, and then maybe that's what caused some of the initial Arab Spring aspect of it in Syria. I mean, I think there was a lot of reasons to be concerned about the repression going on with Sadat. I mean, the thing that it's forced me to consider is, I wonder if that, however that got started, if we had just decided to leave Assad there untouched, a lot more people would be alive right now. A lot more people would not have suffered as to what they've suffered. And I don't know how to balance that, because it's certainly not our decision to decide, well, you deserve to be free, so we're going to wreak havoc on your country. I'm not saying we did that in Syria, but we're doing it now. I mean, I saw people, one of the things I had to ask them when I was doing these questions is it seems silly, why did you leave Syria? They look at you like, but I needed to have something more than just, well, the war. I wanted to get some details. And when I got those details, it was pretty amazing. I mean, so many of them say, we were being bombed by everybody. And that was literally true for them. I mean, the Sadat's government, the U.S., Russia, ISIS, maybe the Taliban, I understand, is now moving into Syria. They're going to give ISIS a challenge. That's in today's headlines. It's horrendous what they're having to do. And then you've heard about the starvation. The communities have been cut off, can't get relief supplies. So there's no question. I mean, why is it surprising that 4 million people have left Syria? The real question is, why are the other 16 million still there? But we're going to see, I think, a lot more migrations, and it's really hard to control. I mean, the way it has to be controlled is, from what little I've studied about this, is the country from which people are leaving has to be the one willing to keep them in. So you've got East Germany able to do that. Turkey wasn't willing to do that until they got 6 billion euros from Germany and Europe. And so then they started, when I was there, they were starting to have little patrols and checkpoints on the roads and stuff. But they obviously are able to do it when they have the incentive to do it. So they stop people from coming. I don't know whether that's a good thing or not. I mean, it means people aren't drowning, but it means 1 million people that didn't drown are still stuck there. And not that, I mean, Turkey's got to be better, I hope, than Syria, but it's not great. But the other issue is we're going to be dealing with is how stable is Turkey going to be? And when is it that the Turks are going to decide it's time to leave Turkey? And so are they then going to be coming over here? What surprised me to realize is that there's actually a border between Turkey and Greece right here. But when this got so reinforced with police and fences and stuff, that's what started to drive this. Now, most recently, what's happening is that's shifted back to Libya. And so you have these huge mass drownings because they're trying to pile up huge boats of people. 500 people drowned, last month or early this month in the Mediterranean because the smugglers were trying to ship people over from, maybe I can pull that, if I can find that one slide, I can show you that. But I've got a couple more minutes for questions if people have got some. It surprised me how many, yes?
Are the people coming without any money? Are they coming with money?
Yeah. I was surprised. Almost all of them had some piece of money. I mean, I never saw much. Every once in a while I might see a belt around them that would have contained money. But they spent 1,000 to 1,500 euros for that boat ride. Children ride free. If it's stormy weather, there's a discount. Really. The worst thing about some of those trips, though, is they've got a huge number of people and they just jam all in the boat. And so suddenly I met a wife and 1 or 2 kids that were separated because the father and one of the kids was on one boat and then they were on another boat, and the second boat got stopped by the Turkish police, so they got stuck. And so when they finally made it over, they made it up to the border, but after it was too late to get across. So their relatives are up in Germany. I mean, it's half the family. But they had money, and a lot of people have a good deal of money, and they're middle class. I don't know, I guess they've brought it over in euros or dollars or something else. I never saw any. I saw something like €1,000 Iraqi dinar, which I think is one of the ones that were at Saddam's time, so they really have no value, just on the beach. But we would see things on the beach at times. But they, most of them had the ability to buy, a €50 ferry ticket, to pay 50 or 60 euros per person to take the bus ride up to the border. And then when they were being allowed across the border, they had to pay for money on the train. Well, that's the end of our time. Thank you very much for letting me come talk to you. Appreciate the Juneau World Affairs Council for having me. Thank you.
That was Eric Kocher in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with 360 North. It was recorded May 16, 2016 at 360 in Juneau, with support from Alaska Power and Telephone, Alaska Electric Light and Power Company, Coeur Alaska Incorporated, GCI, Hecla Greens Creek Mining Company, Haight and Associates, the Prospector Hotel, Sea Alaska, and Wastman and Associates Incorporated.